She erased her own mother from the table, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. She physically removed the one woman who had carried every debt, every bruise, every silent midnight hour that made the wedding possible, and she directed her to eat alone in the kitchen out of sight, because 43 guests were watching and the optics, she had decided, did not work. That single act, lasting no more than 90 seconds from the moment she touched her mother's elbow to the moment the kitchen door swung shut, would cost her more than she could calculate that evening. It would cost her the man she thought she had won. He had 7 words standing in that doorway. 7 words delivered in a voice so quiet that the nearest table had to stop chewing to hear them. He said, "I won't marry someone who does this." Then he set his glass down and waited. The question the rest of this story answers is not whether she lost him. She did. The question is what she had to travel through before she understood what those 7 words actually meant, and whether by the time she understood there was anything left worth saving. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Yeonji Cha had spent 26 years performing competence so convincingly that most people in her orbit had confused the performance for the person. She was the daughter who had won the scholarship, taken the corporate position at 22, furnished the apartment by 24, and announced her engagement at 26 to a man her extended family discussed in reverent, half-frightened murmurs, as though speaking his name too directly might disturb something. His name was Kang Dae-sin. He was 31. He came from a family whose history was long and whose business interests were diverse in the particular way that certain families' business interests are diverse when they prefer their lawyers to do the explaining. Yeonji had known, in the abstract, who he was before she met him. What she had not known, in the concrete, was what he actually paid attention to. That was her foundational error. She had catalogued his power. She had not studied his character. The engagement party was held in the private dining room of a restaurant on the 42nd floor of a building in the city's financial district, a room with floor-to-ceiling glass along the south wall through which the downtown grid spread out in amber and white, orderly and bright and deeply impersonal. The table seated 45. 43 of those seats were filled with people whose approval Yeonji was, in one way or another, actively courting. Kang family associates, business partners, university friends whose careers had elevated them into categories she respected, 2 senior colleagues from her own firm who had accepted the invitation with the particular graciousness of people who are quietly assessing. Her mother, Cha Seon-hwa, had arrived in a dress she'd bought 4 months earlier and paid for in installments. It was the color of winter persimmons, a deep amber orange that she had chosen carefully because someone at the fabric shop had told her it was a festive color, and she had believed them, and she had been right. She looked beautiful. She was 54 years old, with the deliberate posture of a woman who had learned long ago that the world would not make room for her, and who had decided to take up exactly the space she needed, no more. She had raised Yeonji alone from the time Yeonji was 9, working 3 overlapping jobs for 11 of those years, and she had never once, in all of Yeonji's memory, asked to be thanked for it. That restraint had perhaps been a mistake. It had allowed Yeonji to internalize her mother's invisibility as the natural order of things. Seon-hwa had been seated at the near end of the main table, which was not the seat of honor, but was at least a seat at the table. She had folded her hands in her lap and watched the room with the unhurried attention of a woman who found people genuinely interesting. She had smiled at the server who poured her water. She had nodded when the man across from her made a small joke. She was by every observable measure doing exactly what a person does when they are grateful to be included, and when they understand that the evening is not about them. It was not enough. Yeonji had looked at her mother from across the room and had performed a calculation that she would spend the next 8 months trying to undo. She had noted the persimmon dress. She had noted the slight formality of her mother's posture, which read to Yeonji not as dignity, but as out-of-placeness. She had heard with the hypersensitive inner ear of someone whose anxiety is organized around judgment, a comment made by one of the Kang family associates 2 tables over, a comment that was not about her mother at all, but that she had re-aimed at her mother with the precision of a person looking for evidence. And she had walked to the near end of the table. She had leaned down. She had said, in a voice she believed was low enough to be private, something about the kitchen being comfortable and the servers needing to use the main room, which was not true, neither the comfort nor the necessity. And her mother had looked at her for one long moment, the kind of moment that contains many years, and had then folded her napkin and stood and walked to the kitchen without saying a word. Because Seonhwa had never required a stage to maintain her dignity. She had taken it with her. Kang Dae-seon had been standing in the doorway from the corridor, having returned from a phone call for approximately 40 seconds of this exchange, long enough to see the napkin folded, long enough to see the persimmon dress disappear through the swinging door, long enough to set down his glass. 7 words. He had used 7. Yeonji had stood in the center of that room for 8 seconds after he walked out, the ambient conversation filling back in around her like water around a stone, and she had felt something she could not immediately name. It was not embarrassment, though embarrassment was present. It was not grief, though grief was close. It was the sensation of having been seen, clearly and completely, and found insufficient. Not by 43 guests, none of whom had fully registered what had happened. By one person, the one person whose assessment, it turned out, she actually wanted. She did not follow him immediately. That was her second error of the evening. She spent 11 minutes managing the room, explaining his absence as a work call, refilling her own composure from whatever internal reserve she'd been drawing from for 26 years. And by the time she reached the corridor, he was in the elevator, and the elevator was descending, and the number above the door read 12, 11, 10. Days later, he returned 1 call out of 9. He said, in the particular quiet, that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but precision, that he needed time to think, and that in the meantime he had some questions for himself that had nothing to do with her, which she did not believe, and which was not, as it happened, entirely false. He had his own accounting to do. He had chosen her in part because he had read in her the capacity for a certain kind of loyalty, and he was revising that reading carefully, the way a person revises an analysis when new evidence arrives and they have enough intellectual honesty to let the conclusion change. She went to his apartment 12 days after the party. She had rehearsed 4 different versions of what she intended to say, ranging from explanation to apology to reframing, and she delivered none of them, because when he opened the door, he looked at her not with anger, but with a kind of patient sorrow, the expression of a man who had already grieved something and was simply waiting to see if she had caught up yet. She had not. "My mother worked 3 jobs, she said. It came out wrong, as a defense, which was not what she meant. "I know," he said. "I don't know why I did it." He looked at her for a long time. "I think you do," he said. "I think you know exactly why. The part that concerns me is that you haven't said it out loud yet." She left without saying it out loud. 3 weeks later, his family's representative, a man named Im, who was 58 years old and had the manner of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times, it no longer disturbed him, but who remained careful with it as a matter of professional pride, met her at a coffee house near her office. "Im had been in the Kang family's orbit for 22 years. He placed a folded document on the table between them. Not the formal withdrawal of the engagement, which would come through proper channels later, but a personal note from Dae-seon. 3 paragraphs, handwritten. The 3rd paragraph contained one sentence. It read, "When you can tell me honestly why you did what you did and when you have made it right with your mother in a way that she, not you, decides is sufficient, call me." Im folded his hands. "He wanted me to add one thing," Im said. He said, "She deserves a seat at any table you sit at." He meant the woman in the persimmon dress. Yeonji looked at the document for a long time. Outside, the morning traffic moved in its usual indifferent river. A bus stopped and opened its doors and took in 7 people and closed its doors and moved on. "How long has he been watching?" she asked. "He watches everything," Im said. "It's not surveillance, it's just attention. He pays attention. She paid attention. She paid attention." The sentence arrived in her like something she had always known and had simply never turned over to examine. She had confused watching with judging. She had assumed that attention was a form of appraisal, something performed by people in positions of power to assign rank. She had not understood that, for some people, attention was simply the primary way they expressed respect, that to be seen clearly was the gift, not the verdict. She did not call her mother that night. She was not ready, and she had learned enough in the past 3 weeks to know that arriving unready was another form of making the moment about herself. She went home and she sat at her kitchen table with the note in front of her, and she let herself, for the first time since the party, be uncomfortable without managing the discomfort. This took 4 hours. By the end of it, she had cried once, briefly, without drama, and the crying had felt like something structural giving way, a beam that had been carrying too much load for too long. The honest reason, the thing she had not yet said out loud. She had been afraid. Not of her mother, not of the persimmon dress, not of anything her mother had said or done or represented at that table. She had been afraid of being perceived by the 43 people in that room as someone who had come from somewhere ordinary. She had been afraid that her origin would undercut her arrival, that the distance she had traveled, which she privately carried as achievement, would be visible and would be read as lack. She had moved her mother because her mother was the most honest evidence of where she had started, and she had not yet made peace with where she had started. And rather than do that interior work, she had reached out and cleared the evidence from the room. She had used her mother as a thing to be managed. The morning she said this out loud, alone in her kitchen, it cost her something she had not expected to miss, the self-conception of a woman who was good to the people who mattered. That self-conception had been false for at least 1 night, possibly longer. Possibly she needed to audit further back. She was not ready for that audit yet, but she wrote it down as something to return to because she was, underneath everything, someone who did not like unresolved accounts. She called her mother on a Sunday morning. 7 weeks after the party, Seon-hwa answered on the second ring. "I need to tell you something," Yeonji said, "and I want to tell it to you honestly, not as an apology that makes me feel better, but as the true thing." A pause. "All right," Seon-hwa said, and Yeonji told her. The honest reason, the fear, the calculation, the fact that she had looked at the persimmon dress and had not seen her mother's careful love, and had instead seen a liability, and that was a failure she owned entirely, and that she knew she could not undo it and was not asking her mother to pretend it was undone. She was asking only that her mother know that she knew, that the accounting was complete, that she had not arrived at this conversation to make herself comfortable. Seon-hwa listened without interrupting. When Yeonji finished, there was a silence of perhaps 20 seconds that felt much longer. "I know you work hard," Seon-hwa said finally. "I know you are afraid. I have been watching you be afraid for a long time." A pause. "I didn't know how to tell you that being afraid of where you came from is the same as being afraid of me." Yeonji closed her eyes. "I'm not angry," Seon-hwa said. "I was hurt. Those are different. I know. Do you?" The question landed without cruelty and without gentleness. It was simply a question placed there to be answered honestly. I'm learning to, Yeonji said. Months later, the formal withdrawal of the engagement had processed through the appropriate channels, and Yeonji had made no attempt to reverse it, because she had understood, reading the note for the 40th time, that the condition was not a bargaining position. It was a genuine requirement for genuine change, and genuine change had a timeline that could not be manufactured to meet a deadline. She was doing the work. She was not doing it for him. She had started it for him, but somewhere in the 7 weeks between the party and the Sunday phone call, it had shifted to being about something else, something she could only describe, imprecisely, as wanting to be a person she could stand to be. She had returned to the restaurant twice. Once alone, 3 weeks after the party, to sit at the main table in the private room with a glass of water and understand what it had felt like to choose the 43 over the 1. The room in the afternoon without guests was smaller than she remembered, the south wall's view over the city grid simply a view, not an arena. The second time she brought her mother. They ate at a window table on a Wednesday evening. Seonhwa ordered the braised pork and a glass of plum wine, and looked out at the city with the unhurried attention of a woman who found the view genuinely beautiful. And Yeonji watched her and felt something she could not name. Precisely, but that bore no resemblance to discomfort. It was, she thought, closer to pride. The real kind, the kind that flows towards something external. It was M who called her, 6 months after the party, on a Tuesday morning. He did not identify himself, but his voice was identifiable, the particular register of a man who has delivered enough difficult news that the neutral news comes out in the same careful register. He'd like to have coffee, Im said. No agenda set, he said, to tell you your terms, your time, your location. She sat with that for a moment. He wants to know if you found the honest answer, Im said. I found it, she said, months ago. He thought you might have, Im said. He was watching. She told him she would call with the location. She spent 3 days not agonizing over it, which was different from previous versions of herself who would have agonized over it, and on the 4th morning she called M and gave him a coffee house. She knew, because her mother liked it, a small place near the market with good light in the afternoon and no particular prestige. She chose it deliberately. She wanted him to understand, before they exchanged a word, that the performance was over. He was there when she arrived, seated at a table near the window, wearing no particular demonstration of his family's weight. He stood when he saw her. He looked the way she remembered him, and also different, which was to say, he looked like a man who had also been doing work in the intervening months, his own kind, his own accounting. She sat down. He said, "How is she?" She did not need to ask who. "She's well," Yeonji said. "We had dinner last week." She ordered the plum wine. A pause. "She asked about you, actually." He looked at her. "What did she say?" She said. And here Yeonji took a breath, finding the precision. She said, he seemed like a man who knew what to pay attention to. She meant it as a compliment. He was quiet for a moment. "She's right," he said. And then, "I want to tell you something I should have said more clearly." Before he held his coffee cup, did not lift it. "When I left that night, I was not leaving because I was angry at you. I was leaving because I was frightened of something specific." He looked at her. "I was frightened that you were someone who had decided, before looking, what mattered and what didn't. That you had pre-sorted the world, and your mother had ended up in the wrong category, and no evidence was going to move her." She held his gaze. "I have done that," she said. "I am working on it." "I know," he said. "Im told me about the Sunday call, not the contents, just that you made it, and that you didn't ask him to pass the information to me." She had not asked him to. That had been intentional. The work was not for an audience. "The pre-sorting," she said. "You do that too, you know. You had me sorted before we had ever been tested." A pause. He considered this. "Yes," he said. "You're right. I sorted you as someone with the capacity for this kind of honesty. I should have told you what I was seeing and what I needed before the party put it to a test. She looked at him. So we both failed. So we both failed, he agreed. The question is what we do with that. The afternoon light moved across the table between them, the particular quality of light through old glass, in a coffee house near a market, slightly amber, slightly imprecise, the kind of light that makes things look a little warmer than they are, and a little more worth staying in. I don't want the engagement back, she said. Not the way it was. The party on the 42nd floor. The 43 people. What do you want? She thought about this honestly without performing the answer. I want to know you, she said, actually. From here without the 42-floor production. A pause. And I want my mother at whatever table we sit at. Not as a condition. As a fact of how things are. He looked at her for a long moment. That, he said, is the first thing you have said to me in this entire conversation that required no courage at all. He allowed a small, plain thing that was not quite a smile, but was near it because it's simply true, and you know it. She did know it. She had known it since the Sunday phone call, since the moment her mother had said, being afraid of where you came from is the same as being afraid of me, and something structural had given way, and she had understood that the foundation had been her mother all along, and that she had been building on it without naming it, as though the naming would obligate her to something she was not prepared to give. She was prepared now, not because Kang Dae-seon had required it, not because Im had delivered the note, not because the engagement's withdrawal had forced a reckoning. She was prepared because she had sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours and let herself be uncomfortable, and she had discovered, on the other side of that discomfort, that the woman she wanted to be was not very different from the woman her mother had always been, someone who paid absolute attention, who did not pre-sort, who walked into rooms and found people genuinely interesting, who could fold a napkin and stand and maintain every particle of her dignity without needing the room to acknowledge it. She had been raised by a woman who possessed the thing she had been performing. She had spent 17 years not seeing it, from the age of 9, when she became her mother's sole charge, to 26. When the party made the blindness irreversible, because she had been too busy being ashamed of the circumstances around it to look at it directly. That was the honest answer. She had found it. She had said it out loud. She had returned it to the person it was owed to. Outside the market street moved in its ordinary afternoon rhythm a man arranging fruit, 2 elderly women with bags consulting over a stall, a child pointing at something just out of view, that pure unguarded interest in whatever was there. Dae-seon said, "There is a dinner I would like to go to in about 3 weeks small. 8 people. Genuinely small, not performed small." He looked at her. "I would like to bring you, and I would like you to ask your mother. She would come." Yeonji looked at him. "She'll want to know the dress code. Tell her it's casual." "She won't believe you." "Then tell her," he said, "that the man who knows what to pay attention to will be looking for the persimmon dress, because a woman who wears her best to honor an occasion is exactly the person I want at that table." Yeonji said nothing for a moment. There was nothing strategic to add. The statement was complete, and it was true, and it required only the space to settle. "I'll ask her," she said. She called her mother that evening from the walk home, the city moving around her in its usual indifferent energy, the kind of evening that doesn't know it's significant and doesn't need to. Seonhwa answered on the second ring as she always did. "There's a dinner," Yeonji said. 3 weeks. 8 people. "Small. How small is small?" He said, genuinely small. A pause. "What's the dress code?" Yeonji smiled alone on the sidewalk. Not performing the smile for anyone, he said, "Casual," she said. "But he asked me to tell you specifically that he's hoping for the persimmon dress." A longer pause. "He said that. He said that." Another pause. briefer, the kind that contains a person revising something. All right, Xianhua said. I'll see if it still fits. It would fit. Yanji knew it would fit because her mother took care of what she had, carefully and without fanfare, and the persimmon dress was no exception. But she did not say this. She let her mother have this small, ordinary pretense of uncertainty because some things are not improved by being named. She walked the rest of the way, home in the evening air, the city lit in its amber and white grid that looked, from street level, like nothing but ordinary human life going about its ordinary business. And she thought about a word she had been turning over for months. Attention. What it actually meant, as opposed to what she had taken it to mean. She had taken it for surveillance, for appraisal, for judgment delivered from height. She understood now that it was none of those things. Attention was the decision to be genuinely present to what was actually there, not to a category you had assigned in advance, not to a performance you had arranged, but to the actual specific, irreplaceable thing in front of you. Her mother had possessed it entirely, had given it entirely. Had given it to Yeonji across 26 years of three-job exhaustion and installment plan dresses and silent midnight hours, and Yeonji had received that attention and spent 2 decades not understanding what it was, because she had never had a word for it and had never thought to ask. She had the word now. She intended to earn it. Persimmon dress would be at the table. That was not a hope and not a plan and not a condition to be negotiated. It was simply the way things were now, the arrangement of the actual world, as opposed to the arranged performance of it, and the distinction she had learned at considerable cost was everything. She paid attention. She paid attention, not to the 43. To the one, then the other one, then the difficult interior accounting that produces, if you stay with it long enough without flinching, the person you were capable of being all along. That was the whole of it. That was what 7 words and 1 folded napkin had set in motion. Not a punishment and not a reward. A requirement simply. See clearly, name honestly, sit down and begin.